Manage some service. Good morning and welcome to this Navigating Essential Change webinar series from NHS Improving Quality and Arden Commissioning Support. My name is Mark Jennings and I'm chairing this webinar this morning. Hope you've been able to join the programme successfully. If you do have any technical problems, use the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner to contact our tech support team. This morning's webinar is about reconfiguration as part of this Navigating Essential Change webinar series. And of course, many parts of the NHS are considering service reconfiguration of some description. We recently had a Health Service Journal survey that suggests that almost half of clinical commissioning groups will need to consider a major service reconfiguration by next summer. There aren't actually that many of us online at the moment. Hopefully more people will join. But I was going to just use the Blackboard technology to see if we could get people to vote. If you look just under your name, the boxes at the right-hand side, could you vote about whether you, in whatever role you're in, vote as to whether you're likely to be involved in service reconfiguration of some description or not. So there's a simple drop-down box there with yes or no. If you click those, we'll be able to see the results in a moment. Anybody else going to vote? We've only got a few. So far we've got 3 people saying yes. 1 person saying no. So although we've got quite a select audience this morning, looks like most people in some way will be involved in some sort of service reconfiguration, which I guess is why they're joining this call. Just to tell you, the call will be recorded this morning. The webinar will be recorded, so you'll be able to access it later if your colleagues missed it. And if you're interested to, whilst our guest speaker, Simon Angelides, who I'll introduce in a minute, is talking, if you want to ask questions, you can raise your hand. That's the box next to the voting box, if you just raise your hand. Or type a question into the chat box. And Simon has to take questions as we go. So if you raise your hand, we'll bring you in, or if you put your question in the chat box, I'll bring you in at an appropriate point. So I'll start the webinar by introducing Simon Angelides. He's the project director at Arden CSU. Simon has vast experience of service reconfiguration, most recently in Worcestershire, where he was the project director for reconfiguring services across Worcestershire. He's also had a wide career in the private sector and in organisations such as Transport for London and IBM, as well as his more recent career in the NHS. And Simon's going to share his expertise with us. And the first of these series of Navigating Essential Change. And the first one that Simon's going to talk to us about is thinking about service reconfiguration. So Simon's going to talk for about 15 minutes, and you'll see the slides on screen as we go. As I say, please join in the debate, ask questions, put them in the chat box as we go. But Simon, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So the purpose of this first webinar is to think about the way in which one would approach developing a reconfiguration program. So what are the fundamental questions that you need to think about when starting the program up in terms of the scope, who needs to be involved, the approach that you'd use? So the purpose of this is to think through some of the core questions that you need to ask yourselves in developing and kicking off the program. We're also going to think about some of the common features which are present across all types of reconfiguration, regardless of the size or the clinical services that are being considered. And also to think about the starting point for which you might want to develop a program. So what are the key things that you need to have in place before you kick off the program or very soon after? So with this first set of slides, we're going to think about the background. So what do we mean by the term service reconfiguration? What's the legal and policy structures that sit behind it and that frame the development of any type of program or the development of a reconfiguration proposal? And what type of change to clinical services actually makes a reconfiguration? This is something which is being highlighted more and more as smaller and smaller changes to clinical services come into the scope of reconfigurations, and therefore is very much a moving feast and quite topical at the moment. So what is reconfiguration? I think the best summary that I found is in the NHS London Reconfiguration Guide of 2011, which says that reconfiguration is a term used to describe major service change or service improvement. Again, the word major here is the key one, as that frames the way that you would think about whether or not the project or the changes you're making should be considered to be a reconfiguration. The service change proposal, which would be the basis of any reconfiguration, needs to be assured against the 4 tests, formerly known as the Lansley test, but is also subject to competition and procurement law, as well as it also must support commissioner duties, and these were spelled out in the 2006 NHS Act. The service change proposal is then subject to a public consultation and requires explicit support from the clinical commissioning group as well as from the wider health economy. Again, these are really important in terms of finalising and having the final approval of any service change proposal. So what makes a clinical service change a reconfiguration? As I said earlier, this is a moving feast and something which is subject to quite a considerable amount of change. There are no single set of parameters and each context is different. However, NHS England is responsible for providing advice, so you need to look to your LAT or your regional teams that will be able to give you some guidance. However, it's also the responsibility of the local health overview and scrutiny committee in the local council to take a view on this. And between NHS England and the HOSC, they will be able to give some clear guidance as to whether or not the changes will come within the permit of a reconfiguration. There are 2 broad principles that I think could be provided to give you some insight before you go and ask these questions. The first is that clinical service change needs to make a meaningful change to the way the patient experiences the delivery of clinical services. So this means that it needs to be more than the movement of a podiatrist clinic a couple of miles up the road, but it needs to be less than the closure of the local A&E. Again, this is something which is dependent on the local context. Also, a reconfiguration might be considered to be one if the changes to the services are considered to be contentious. So what in one local health economy might consider to be quite small and insignificant in terms of the changes might have a significantly greater political view being taken within other contexts. So again, it's very much dependent on what happens within the local context. The final thing to say on this is that the definition isn't static, it's moving, and even if we consider what's happened in the last 5 to 6 years in terms of what would be classed as a reconfiguration, this has significantly changed and moved on. And there's this ongoing pressure to have greater public involvement with the development of reconfiguration proposals. So I can only see that smaller changes are likely to become in place which get brought into service reconfigurations. The next set of slides are thinking about the starting point for how you start developing a reconfiguration program. So what we're going to do is look at the when, how, who, the why and the what, just so that we've got a clearer view as to what are the base questions that you need to be asking and how would you start thinking about framing the program. So to do this, when should you think about beginning the reconfiguration of clinical services? This is quite a contentious issue because given the length of time it takes to deliver these changes. Who needs to be involved in starting a reconfiguration program? Is it sufficient just to have a CCG, or how far into the health economy landscape do you need to engage in those initial stages? What needs to be considered when framing the structure of a service reconfiguration? And how should the program be structured itself? So some fairly generic basic questions that we're just going to consider at a high level at this stage. So when? when should you start thinking about a service reconfiguration? Well, this depends on the strategy for the local health economy. Some health economies have taken an approach that is much more of a rolling set of programs, whereby they make gradual changes to different services on different timescales. Another approach is to have a single program which is at scale, which can be much more impacted by external pressures and local politics, but allows more radical solutions to be delivered. In terms of thinking about the approach that you should be taking, so the rolling programs can take 2 to 3 years to go and implement from their initial start. This has been true in Gloucestershire, which have been developing their A&E services more recently. Single programs need to be considered in a longer time frame of at least 4 to 5 years. And if we look at the program that I was involved in over in Worcestershire, that's had similar sorts of timescales for its development. However, one of the key factors about thinking about the timescales is the relationship between the commissioners and providers. This can have a significant impact on the timescales in terms of ensuring there's good cooperation and aligned views to go and push forward the changes. If that isn't in place, then I think the timescales need to reflect the difficulties that you're liable to find in terms of getting an agreement and a consolidated view. Who needs to be involved? Well, it's quite clear from the policy guidance that NHS commissioners are responsible for leading service reconfiguration by describing a change to their commissioning intentions. However, a service change is likely to have an impact on the wider health economy, and therefore other stakeholder groups need to be considered when thinking about who to involve at these initial stages. So surrounding commissioners need to take a view and need to be potentially brought into the programme. The providers that will be impacted, but also secondary providers that are likely to be impacted by changes in patient flows and the development of services that are likely to impact their plans for the delivery to their patients. Patient and public is obviously a key one. Again, one of the issues here is not to get too heavily involved at this initial stage, but on the other hand, you don't want to be coming to the public with pre-formed views about what the solution is for the local health economy. So trying to get the balance right there is key. Local councils need to be brought in because ultimately they are one of the key gateways that any proposal needs to go through. So having early involvement with them is key. And finally, the regulators, because they can go and provide some guidance as to the various assurance processes you need to go through. However, I think for me, it's being clear with the commissioners about the approach that you're trying to take. The recent case in South West London, where the membership of the CCG was unwilling to back the reconfiguration proposal, meant that the development of the programme had to substantially go backwards, and therefore has delayed by between a year and 2 years the overall plans that to be put in place. So being clear with your membership for the CCG, I think, is a really essential, and it's something at times I think somewhat forgotten with the difficulties that are created by other stakeholder groups. I think we then come on to local clinical leadership. I think it's really important in shaping the development of the programme as well as the proposals. The local leadership has a central role in defining the approach and providing leadership in terms of the way in which services need to be developed. So the clinical leaders need to link into the localities and provide local leadership, but also use that relationship in terms of developing the programme as it goes forwards. The use of independent clinical input can obviously, on occasions, be quite powerful in trying to create consensus, where different views emerge about the priorities for the proposal. Clinical selects and networks also need to be considered at an early point by the clinical leadership in the development of any thinking. They can be brought in both in terms of to go and give an independent or a quasi-independent view, but also provide subject matter expertise, especially where services need to be developed, again, outside of the local patch. In terms of creating a shared narrative across the local health economy, I think one of the key points is to consider whether there's consensus. Is there supporting evidence that the changes that should for the case for change and the development of the proposals? Is this evidence recognised across the whole of the local health economy? There are cases where differing opinions can emerge about the priorities and the validity of the evidence. Would this evidence be support external scrutiny? Obviously, the clinical senates play a key role here, so being clear about the evidence that you need at an early stage is really important. But does there need to be consensus? Does there need to be unanimity between the various commissioners and providers? Well, I don't think there does, but what there needs to be is firm agreement by which the principles for consensus can be reached. So you need to be clear about the process you're going to go through, the values that you're going to take into the programme, and the approach that you're going to take to considering the change. You don't necessarily need to have a complete consensus from the start. But also there needs to be consensus in terms of making sure there's a balance between quality, access, finance, workforce, etc. As there will need to be compromises. It's unlikely that everybody that will have a view about what the final proposal should look like will be able to get everything pushed through. So there is going to be a need to be compromised between the various stakeholders, and this will develop over time, as it's likely to need to be an iterative process. The sorts of considerations and evidence that's likely to appear as the process moves forward will have an impact on different stakeholders in different ways. So being clear about the way in which you're going to reach consensus without necessarily having that view at the beginning is really important. For commissioners, it is essential that you're clear about how you describe your commissioning intentions. So for many reconfigurations, they often dive into where the solution needs to start from, whereas in actual fact what we need to be thinking about is how do you describe your current commissioning intentions for your local community. So have you got any prospectuses that have been published? What are your 5-year plans? What's your RTT, urgent care strategies? Are there any other wider health and social care strategies that the commissioners have committed to? However, the commissioning intentions also need to be considered within the wider context, especially as we move towards a co-commissioning and primary care. So consideration of health and wellbeing board strategies, better care funds, other commissioners and other provider strategies and the relationship between those. I think too often programmes dive into trying to establish the case for change without fully considering the landscape in which those existing priorities are already set out. The case for change for me is really where the programme kicks off. It describes what the problem is. Unlike procurements, service reconfiguration proposals need to demonstrate they've been developed with an open mind. And this means that they need to go in when you're developing the case for change without a preconception of what the solutions can be, because should you be challenged later, there's a need to be able to demonstrate a really robust audit process and that can support the decisions that have been made. So being clear about describing what the problem is in the case for change and then having an analysis phase afterwards and having a clear gap between the two is really quite important. You need to make sure you've got specialist advice even at this early stage to make sure that you've got the right framework for generating the decisions that are going to support the proposal. It's likely that this process won't be considered for scrutiny until after you've made a decision about the proposals that are being taken forward and are being submitted for public consultation. We've done some analysis recently that suggests that only 25% of recent cases for change share the same core content in terms of describing the finances, workforce, quality. And that means that they're all starting from very different positions. That makes having a robust, consistent framework for making decisions as you go through the programme much more difficult, and therefore much more subject to challenge further down should the proposals be challenged at a later stage. So what we've got here is Arden, along with partners, is working to develop a framework for thinking about how reconfigurations can be developed. So we're working on something called the Reconfiguration Roadmap, which considers the various elements that you need to be brought into the programme and how they be supported by partners. This is in an early stage, and we're looking for development partners at the moment. But what we're trying to do is put together a framework that provides clear guidance at a practical level about what needs to happen. And it's one that we're going to focus on in the next webinar on the 22nd of January. Again, I'd ask that you go and have a look at the slide deck, and it's something we're quite keen on getting support in terms of partners from around the NHS, as we're going to be kicking this off over the next year. So the next question is, how do we ensure patients are at the centre of decisions? The programmes needs to be transparent wherever possible. I think reconfigurations have a poor reputation, as the NHS is seen as keeping a lot of decisions within the tent and not being as transparent as they could be. The more we're able to open up and engage with the public, I think the easier, especially in these early stages, the easier the proposals will be in the development. Patients need to be more fully brought into the development of the programme, and that means that not only do we need to bring them in, but they also have to be able to have a level of influence over the development of the decisions and the input that's being provided. This means that clinicians will have to cede some of their authority to patients and the public in terms of the approach that's being used, and be able to make the case more strongly to them. They need to be able to shape the way in which the wider public is being engaged, and also they need to be central to any development around patient choice. This is obviously a hot topic at the moment in terms of the way in which choice is being considered within the NHS. But again, it's one of the 4 tests, and therefore it's something that it's quite key that we have the public to go and reflect on. Finally,
can I just interrupt a minute? And we have a question from Marie-Louise, and I'll just paraphrase it because it's pertinent to what you're just talking about. And the question is really, particularly when you're talking about patients and the public, how early in the process of thinking about reconfiguration do you think people should be engaging the patients and public?
Well, I think you need to be doing that when you're developing the case for change. Often the description of the issues that providers and commissioners face has already been pre-formed before you get to developing. It's been developed in the case for change, it's already been codified, clinicians are already brought into it, and the patients and public are often brought in once that's already been developed and it is quite clearly articulated. I think the public needs to be brought in at a much earlier stage to actually co-define what those issues are and the way in which those issues are described, because it then has an impact on if they can co-define the question, it makes them feel that they're co-defining the answer. And
would you say that would you say you always advise bring patients and public in? It's never too early to do that, or is there a point at which it is too early?
I think you've got to have a consensus that there's an issue that needs to be addressed, but you don't want the public to be brought in to rubber stamp the case for change. They've got to co-design that case for change and brought in at that stage. I think it's a balance, but I think too often the public and patients have a problem to describe to them, and therefore a potential solution described to them as well. And I think that's too late, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to carry on?
Okay. Again, I think this then comes back, Mark, to the second point, the final point on the slide, which is to do with commissioner membership. The public can express its opinions directly, and there's often pressure groups that are involved. But also the commissioning membership, this is a new development with CCGs, and is a mechanism which is more indirect but can put significantly more pressure on CCGs as they try and make decisions in terms of making sure the membership's brought with them. So again, if you've got engagement early, and I'm being slightly prescriptive about when that should be, I think that level of engagement would support the development of the process and the development finally of the proposals, rather than it being seen as a fait accompli that sometimes some of the pressure groups feel it is. So just to summarise, early engagement with the various stakeholder and assurance gateways is really important. Being clear about what you need to do and the gateways that you need to jump through and the evidence that needs to be produced by the regulators and the assurance processes that need to be supported needs to frame the development of the programme for a very early stage. An inclusive stakeholder group is going to be the thing that drives the change the quickest. It is very easy and much more secure to have a smaller stakeholder group, but then the issue is that problems often appear later in the process, rather than having a wider membership and getting everybody on board in terms of creating a broad church early in the process. I think also CCGs need to be clear that the level of resourcing, and especially in terms of investment of senior time, is significant. It is going to be one of the things that is going to dominate the agenda for that CCG as it moves forward. And also to be clear about the process and what's expected from the CCG and the development processes that are going to support it. So it's very much around trying to make sure that you frame the programme in terms of where you want to get to at the end, rather than taking a more taking the process where you're less clear about what needs to be presented, especially in terms of the assurance gateways, because redoing work or redefining work that's already been done can be both costly and time consuming. So those are some of my key points going forwards. So Mark, I think I've tried to keep it to about 20 minutes. We're just a bit over. So
Thank you very much, Simon. That was excellent. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us. I think that was quite a good review of sort of both the technical and strategic issues associated with service reconfiguration. I'd urge those who are online to ask a question if they can, either by raising their hand or typing it into the chat box. I'm just going to kick off the questions with the first question before we move to the ones coming in from the chat boxes. Simon, you mentioned the fact that you don't really need a consensus in order to get going on service reconfiguration, but you need a process to get to consensus. What in your experience does that sort of process for obtaining consensus look like, and how long is that likely to take?
Well, the process for getting to consensus, I think you've got to have a set of values that you're trying to agree to. You've got to be clear about the evidence and the weight of that evidence. And you've also got to be clear about the fact that there will be compromises on both sides. So where it's about the values and the trust that you've got in the other parties round the table that will go and allow you to go and create that consensus. Because again, there is likely to be evidence which suggests different solutions and different questions and different problems. And it's the weighting of what you put against that different evidence that's sort of key. In terms of the timescale, I think it really reflects on the way in which health economies are functioning and the relationships. So this could be something which is relatively quick to move forward through, or it could be something which remains contentious throughout the life of the programme, and it's something which needs to be brought back to the table on a fairly regular basis to make sure that everybody is agreed and signed up. So, yep.
Very much context dependent. Just I'll follow up a question which we got from someone who's online, TF2. Somebody who hasn't given us their name, but I'll read out the question. Following on from that, what's the likely budget for delivering a service reconfiguration? What's the average cost of the service reconfiguration program?
Well,
that sounds quite tricky to answer to me, isn't it?
No, but I think I think there are elements which are givens, and then I think it depends on the local context. So again, making sure that you've done your quality impact early in the process. So a fair amount of budget needs to be set aside for that. You obviously need to think about comms and engagement. Again, you don't want to necessarily completely go too heavy on that to start off with, but again, you've got to be devoting both comms and engagement resources to that, but also senior management time to that in terms of getting out to all the various groups that's going to be impacted, especially coming out of the quality impact assessment. I think making sure that you get professional advice early on in the process so that you're clear about the decision-making route that you're going to go and take, and then having a strong program team sitting behind it, which is going to make sure you've got a good audit trail, there's a clear governance and accountability structure, and that you're tied in, and what you're developing will support the assurance processes that you've got going forwards and develop the strength of the proposal, rather than finding that you've got some areas that are lacking because you just haven't provided the resources you need to. So I think it's difficult, but there are some givens which I think need to be considered in a bit more detail.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to one of our callers online now, Lorraine Kelly, who's put quite a long message in the chat box. I wonder, Lorraine, are you able to speak to us on YouTube? Are you there, Lorraine? Technical team on YouTube, Lorraine? Hello, Lorraine?
Lorraine hasn't got a mic. She's posted into the chat box.
All right, thank you. Okay, well, I'll read out what Lorraine's saying on her behalf. I'm sure I don't sound like Lorraine, but I'll do my best. I work for a hospital trust. We need to make significant changes to maintain viability that will involve moving services from one hospital to another, which will undoubtedly be very controversial. This will involve an honest debate about which services will be, I lost my place, which services will be better delivered in the community, and not provided by the hospital at all. From what you said, it sounds like the starting point really needs to be with the CCG, which should understand be leading this rather than being a hospital-led change. So in summary, should this sort of change be commissioner-led? Simon, what would you think, or what's the role for the acute provider in this?
Okay. Well, I think it's accountability for the change does sit under the Health and Social Care Act with the commissioners. This is the same as with the PCT. The trusts are able to make changes to the delivery of services under emergency powers, but plan changes need to be led by commissioners. Having said that, they are the ones that are accountable if you get taken to judicial review or it gets taken to IRP, etc. But what the CCGs should be doing is reflecting that the provider needs to change the way it's delivering its services. So there needs to be some sort of really robust discussions between the CCG and the provider about how they're going to go and take these forward. So it should be in tandem. It shouldn't just be a provider-led, and it shouldn't be CCG-led. The CCG has responsibility, but it's for both parties to go and to work collaboratively, again, within the wider context of the local health economy, about how you're going to go and move those forward. So I think it's about making sure that framing is the right framing as well. And it's about bringing in the right people at the right time and making sure that the CCG is on board with that. So I hope that's of help.
Yeah, well, we'll ask Elaine to type a response back in if see what she thinks about that. She's saying, yes, thank you. And turn to me, Simon, what you're saying there is really that any parties in this complex health and social care world we live in, if they try to move alone, they're likely to be less powerful than if they move in concert with their partners in the system.
Well, I think the problem there, Mark, is that you get into this, it becomes a bit of a vicious circle in terms of you can't really move ahead unless everybody is supporting the change. And that whilst you can think you're making progress, I see reconfiguration as a bit of a line, and you can move forwards in terms of getting consensus and getting a shared view and a shared vision, making sure that everybody's clear on the weight of the evidence, but you can also move backwards as well. So it's not a process which is going in one direction. You know, you can paddle the canoe in one direction, you can also paddle it in the other. And if you've got everybody lined up, and again, it's about shared values and trust and about how you move it forwards, rather than, and that will be the approach that you need to take, rather than it being about we've done this piece of work and then we move forward to this piece of work. It's relatively easy to go backwards in these situations.
Okay, thank you. I haven't got any more questions coming in online. If anybody wants to ask any final questions, if they've raised their hand, I'll ask you one thing myself whilst we're waiting for anybody else to come in. You stressed quite heavily, Simon, the role and responsibilities of local clinicians on the CCG, GPs on the CCG, to sort of be responsible for the consensus over the change, for getting democratic representation from their colleagues, whilst also supporting the change. And you cited the South West London example of where that has gone wrong. Isn't that the South West London example sort of fairly typical of what's going to happen, that we're almost trying to ask some of our clinical colleagues here on CCGs to do the impossible, to both represent their colleagues and represent the need for major service change?
I think you're right, Mark. I mean, one of in terms of reconfiguration, CCGs are much more accountable to their GP community and therefore to their local community than PCTs ever were. So being clear about, so in terms of the clarity that local clinical leadership can bring, is going to be a balance, and I think it's a very difficult balance, and I'm not sure that that the impact of doing this has been fully thought through in the new system, and the support being given to those leaders, especially the clinical chairs of CCGs, in terms of being able to both lead proposals which are potentially contentious, but also being able to reflect back into the development of these programs the concerns of local communities. So I think you are right. I think it is very difficult, and especially with CCGs that, if you're talking about major reconfigurations, and especially with the co-commissioning agenda with specialised services, this is going to become even more acute, whereby small CCGs might be opposed to changes that are being led by larger CCGs or through co-commissioning. So I think that the support that's being provided and making sure that there's an equitable balance is something which I think needs a lot more thought and is very much dependent on the local context. So, there's a balance to be had, and I think that it's quite a difficult balance to strike.
Yeah, difficult role for some of those individuals. We've got a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to go to, I know online we've got Charlie Keeney, who's director of the CCG and primary care program at the NHS Improving Quality. Charlie, I wonder if you've got a question you want to put to Simon.
Thanks very much, Mark. Simon, I was just struck by your observation that only a quarter of recent cases of change have the same core content. To me, that suggests the NHS is going about changing in very different ways and isn't kind of learning from some of the better examples. Is what you're advocating with a future programme going to develop some resources around what would look like good, solid content, consistent content to cover in terms of workforce, patient engagement, finance, and so on?
Just to say, this was highlighted by the King's Fund report that came out yesterday, that the NHS, in its view, doesn't have a robust methodology for undertaking service change. They looked at it from a perspective of NCAT and the clinical senates. We've looked at it from the perspective of the case for change and the differing approaches that are being made there to describing what the problems are for the local health economy. I think we are advocating this programme, and I'm quite keen to hear from people that would like to get involved in terms of actually having a practical structure for the development programme. So it's not focused on the different clinical strategies that you'd have, but how do you make sure that you've got a robust programme management framework? What's the approach you're going to be to risk? How do you make sure that you've got a clear view about how the finances were working? What's the approach that you'd use to consider patient choice, so that there's more consistency across the different programs and less variability? Because I think it is an issue. It's been an issue for some time, and increasingly as reconfigurations get subject to a consistent bar of IRP and judicial review, which they will expect all proposals to be able to jump over. The inability of the NHS to learn from other areas and bring that best practice and actually have a consistent approach is going to become more acute. So.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, Charlie, and thank you, Simon. I think with only a few minutes to go, I'm going to draw this to a close unless there's any more last-minute hands raised, which I don't think there are. So, Simon, thank you very much for the presentation and for tackling the questions today. Thank you very much to all of those of you who joined online. I'm sure more colleagues will join us and listen to the recording, which will be available online, and the link will be emailed out to everyone on the mailing list with that recording link. Just a reminder that this is the first of a series of 3 webinars on navigating essential change. Dates for your diary: 22nd of January 2015, where we'll be looking at setting up a programme the service reconfiguration program, and then the 4th of February 2015, which will focus on the key aspects of governance of the service reconfiguration program. So, Simon, any final words from you?
No, just thank you, Mark, and thank you, Charlie, for giving us the opportunity to go and sort of express our thoughts and reflect on sort of what's quite a contentious issue. So I look forward to seeing you at the end of January.
Thank you. And you'll see there's a note on the screen asking you if you want to click that link for to give us feedback for the SurveyMonkey site. And if you're interested in the development of the reconfiguration roadmap, Arden, Simon in particular, will be very keen to hear from you, and there's an email address there for Arden CSU. So thank you all very much. Look forward to joining with you again on the 22nd of January. Thank you very much. Goodbye.